Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar that's going to focus on Idaho's Stay Healthy Order and what all of you as employers should know for a successful transition to whether you're reopening your business or moving into this new environment. My name is Jason Castor. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer from Parsons, Bailey & Latimer. And again, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us early this morning for today's webinar. We've got a number of people that have already joined the call. It looks like a number are still rolling in, but in the interest of everybody's time, we're going to get started. I'd like to begin by introducing Pam Eaton. Pam is the President and CEO from the Idaho Retailers Association and the Idaho Lodging and Restaurant Association. I'm sure many of you know Pam. But nonetheless, Pam, thank you for partnering with us on today's presentation and being here with us today. Pam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone that's joining us, and thank you for joining us. I know that I've been sending tons of information out to all of our folks, and we thought this was a great way to kind of condense that and put it all together and quickly get it out to all of you. So hopefully you guys all find this of value. And again, I thank everyone for getting up this morning and joining us. I thank the team at Parsons, Bailey & Latimer for putting this on. It's very appreciative. And with that, I will turn it back over to all of you.
Great. Thank you, Pam. And thanks again for being with us today. So what I'd like to do now is we kick this presentation off. We recognize that all of you are dealing with a variety of issues with respect to COVID-19. And our team today has prepared a very substantive presentation that's going to provide you with practical guidance with respect to the legal issues and implications associated with COVID-19. And we hope that you find this information to be of value and you can use this information to help you get back to work and to avoid any risk associated with COVID-19. In terms of the webinar format today, all the lines will be muted. We will be taking Q&A through our chat function. You can either send those chats directly to me, Jason Castor, or to Sean Monson, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share not only the recording, but also the slides from our presenters today with you after the call. So with that, I'm going to move to our next slide here and just quickly touch base on a legal disclaimer. It wouldn't be right if we didn't tee off with a legal disclaimer for today's presentation. But today's presentation is a source of general information and should not be considered as legal advice. If you have questions about how this information relates to your business, please consult with your legal counsel. And with that, I would like to now introduce and turn the time over to Sean Monson. Sean is the chair of the firm's Employment and Labor Department. Sean, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone for joining us today. You know, as I think about how much the world has changed since Rudy Gobert was tested positive for COVID-19 in Oklahoma City and the NBA shut down its season, which led to a seemingly cascading events of business closures, there's two issues that I think were important to employers and to companies before all this happened. They're going to be important to companies and to employers after this is over or after we return to some semblance of normalcy. And that is, how do you manage risk as an employer and company, and how do you provide an environment so that your employees can work efficiently and your customers can feel safe buying your products and services? And that's really kind of what the focus is that we have today, is we want to help you understand how you can open or continue business operations in the COVID-19 era in a way that minimizes risk and in a way that makes your employees feel that they are safe and they can work effectively, efficiently, and that your customers can feel safe coming to your workplace to buy your products or services. And the reason why this is important, the reason why I kind of want to introduce this holistically from a 30,000-foot level is when, a few weeks after the pandemic began and companies and employers began shutting their doors, you began to see some lawsuits against companies that had remained open. And those lawsuits involved claims by employees and by customers that the workplace and or the business place was not kept clean and was not kept sanitized from COVID-19. And so as you're thinking about the prospects of reopening or continuing to operate in the COVID-19 era, that threat of liability is always going to be in the backdrop. Now in Utah, where some of us practice, the legislature has passed a statute that is an attempt to immunize liability. In Idaho, such a statute has not been passed, although there is discussion on the federal level. The Republicans in the Senate are talking about creating a statute that would immunize employers and businesses that open up from potentially COVID-19 liability. But even if that statute passes, it doesn't necessarily give you a clean ticket or a get out of jail free card. And the point that we want to get across today is that if you follow the guidance that we give you of creating a plan, of following CDC guidelines, following OSHA guidelines, following state and local health directives, as well as doing temperature testing and other symptom testing for your employees, even if you have the unfortunate event of someone in your workplace contracts COVID-19, if you follow the steps that we talk about today, you can feel that you're in a pretty good position to defeat that lawsuit or not be liable. So that's kind of what we're trying to do today, and we'd like to help you understand and have a discussion about steps you can take to manage that risk, and manage the risk of liability, and steps you can take to make your employees feel comfortable and your customers feel comfortable to the extent possible in coming back to your workplace as you reopen. And with that, the next presenter is going to be Amy Lombardo, who's going to talk about probably one of the most important considerations as you think about reopening, and that is creating a plan.
Thanks, Sean. So I'm going to talk about the overview of Idaho law from a broad perspective, and then a return to work roadmap. And we've all been talking about return to work as a term that's easy to throw around. All of us mean this in the broad sense. So we do not believe that you have been sitting home, binge watching TV for the past 7 weeks. In fact, we know that a lot of the industries who are joining us today have been hit pretty hard, and that you've been working hard to maintain what you're doing. So return in this case hopefully means returning your business to its fullest potential. The governor's guidelines in Idaho lay out a 4-stage plan, which follows the president's guidelines. And through each stage, even through until stage 4, each stage includes some restrictions. So physical distancing, there are travel restrictions, and suggestions that vulnerable Idahoans should continue to self-isolate. And for employers, you should note that the guidelines say that members of households with vulnerable residents should be aware that by returning to work, you could carry the virus back home. There's some specific guidance that Sean will talk about later for food industries, but if you have specific guidance, it's being released for specific industries at each stage. So currently we are in stage 1, and for all employers, you should be looking at the stage 1 guidance. And here we would tell businesses normally, and if you are not a retail or a hotel or a restaurant, we would tell you these are the first things to look at. Please continue to telework and consider returning your employees to work in phases if you can accomplish the physical distancing, the sanitation, and the personal protections. But for those of you in the restaurant and retail industries, stage 2 is when dining rooms can open once plans have been submitted to the local public health district. Something to remember as we go through this is that, and I think Sean touched on this a little as well, is that employee confidence and consumer confidence, as well as getting control, if we can, over the virus, are the things that are going to lead to business stability and growth. Just a little on why a business needs a plan. Obviously, everyone wants the health of their workforce. Everyone wants their workforce to be healthy. People show up to work when they are healthy. And we don't know yet the full picture on where the liability will fall. So one impact of business or of government's reopening is that employers shoulder a little bit more of that burden and need to now be considering the best practices and following things to protect your business and to build public confidence in your business. And as I'll talk about, training is important. Saying things a number of times is important. So I will tell you a number of times that restaurants, so far they're the only entity that needs to do this, but they should submit plans to their local health district. So here's the overall guidance of kind of a step-by-step number of things that you should look at and keep in mind when you're deciding on your plan to reopen. And the first one is to set up a decision team. Typically, you'd have a few people in your business. The size of the team will depend on the size of your business, but try to select some decision makers who will kind of be in charge for every step of the way and try to represent all viewpoints in the decision team. So if you have, servers or some people who are not in management or some people who are of different backgrounds, ethnic groups, genders, this will all help you to get a lot of perspectives and help protect you against some claims that could come later. Next slide. So the second thing is to identify the data that you're going to use to make these decisions. And of course, there is so much data out there, and so you'll need to check back, it feels like almost continuously, with guidance from the CDC, OSHA, EEOC, your state and local orders, county and city orders, and particularly in Idaho, each health department may have their own guidance, although some have referred back to the state guidance. And then your industry and trade guidance from PAM. On the item that I'll talk about probably the most is to prepare and revise your written plans and policies. So there are multiple things that employment lawyers talk about when we're talking to employers, but the big ones are leadership, communication always, and documentation. So for leadership in this context, that means you need your managers, your people who are on the ground with the employees every day, following the guidelines that you set out and following your policies and procedures. An example here would be, if you are having all of your employees wear masks, then leadership should do the same and demonstrate that. So next is communication. You need to decide, you need to recognize that you'll need to send out communications to your employees, to the public and to business partners. So you need to work with people like your landlord as you go through this process. You need to inform the public on how your policies are going to work. And in fact, in stage 2, the governor's guidance recommends that you sort of share your policies widely. On communication, we also recommend that you over-communicate. So it'll help you later down the road if employees know what to expect and they understand, for example, what to do when you get a positive case, and so that they're not, wondering, is it safe to go back to work? On documentation, you should assign someone to document everything that you want documented so that it gets done. Attendance records should be taken. This will help in contact tracing later. If it's not, typically you would track this for wage and hour reasons. There are some businesses that don't track this as often, but it's a good idea to figure out if you can implement that policy now. And then, as we'll talk about in each category, probably there are confidentiality concerns. So if you receive any medical records, you need to have them in a separate location. As part of this process, you should look at the procedures and policies that you have. And Liz will talk about the Families First Response Act leave policies. Make sure you have a policy in place. Review your existing sick policies and see if they need to be updated or if you need a temporary policy. Remote work policies, emergency plans. You should be updating your protocols for cleaning, for if you receive a positive test, and just take a look at all of these, draft or revise them if you need to, and follow the policies in a uniform, non-discriminatory manner. Prepare your physical space. I'll just touch on this a little. Sean will talk about this a little bit more, but we suggest physically walking through and following what your employees, what your guests will be doing. So from the parking lot to your entrance, where are the areas where people are going to congregate? In a regular office, those might be things like a secretary's desk or in front of the elevator. All workplaces would have high traffic and congestion areas in the kitchen, the break room for sure, and figure out how you're going to sort of manage the traffic flow there and manage, do you need to close down certain areas? Do you need to have people only bring a lunch? On breaks, are you going to allow people to go inside and outside of your space? And just think of all of those things as you're going through. And there is specific guidance on these things as well. Next slide. Oh. So when you are creating your protocols, you need to address those issues that you find. So do people back up in lines at checkout or when ordering? Is there a way that you can do this touchless or have people call in advance? Do you need to have one-way aisles in your grocery stores? Is there a way to, what you'll likely need to do is hire additional cleaners during the day for those high touch points and assign people or systems to get this done. if you have areas where people share equipment, figure out a way to sanitize those areas. And then again, figure out which portions of your workplace are your responsibility, which are your landlords, and which you can control. Maybe remove some things that are decorative, that you don't, that aren't a key part of your business. So in making the plan concerning your people, you need to think about employees and vendors and customers. And do we want, each group back in the office at the same time, or can they be staggered based on job duties? Essentially, you're doing this so that not everyone gets sick at the same time. Do you have a large enough space where, one section of the workplace can have some people, or can have one team member, and another section can have another team member? You can spread them out physically, or you can spread them out based on schedules and job duties. Once you do this, and your team gets together and decides who's essential, who are we going to bring back first, make sure to take a look and see if everyone you've chosen is female, or if everyone you've chosen is of the same, race. See if there are any discrimination concerns, and see if you can head those off in advance. You should be thinking about training your employees and with daily communication. Next, please. Next slide, we've talked about that one. And then your communication. So you should communicate with your employees often. You should document your policies, document your communication with your employees. There's a lot of guidance around signage and letting third parties know who come into your place of business what they should be doing and your new procedures for that. We've seen a lot of employers kind of implement a safety huddle or a team discussion or a phone call, whether that's in person or not will depend on your business and your practices. But is there a way that everyone can be in communication about what's going on in real time or for each shift? Next. And then see if there's a way for you to monitor the communications that you have going out and monitor how your communications are being received. So you can use surveys to monitor employee questions. One thing that might be mentioned later is you can also use surveys to see how your employees are feeling about coming back to work. We've seen that, and you all have probably seen this as well. If you've continued to work, you might have employees who are either stressed about things that are happening at home or stressed about coming into the office. It's just an added stressor for many people right now. So it's another good reason to keep communication lines open and talk to everyone, have them tell you if they have concerns. And then include guidelines for disciplining non-compliant employees, and then be consistent in applying those. On documentation, just wanted to mention that you can get pretty granular on this. You may want to document who's in the office where, who came to your safety huddles. Next slide. And then just be aware that we could return to stage 1 or pre-stage 1 at any time. And if you get a positive case, you may have to shut down for a period of time. So see this as maybe not a linear event, but be able to change as needed.
All right, thanks, Amy. I'm going to be real quick here and try to just kind of go through these slides as fast as I can. The one overarching thing that I want you to remember from what I'm going to talk about is that make sure when you are thinking about reopening that you either do it yourself or you have assistance from an attorney. Look up the guidelines from the CDC, from OSHA, from the state of Idaho, and from local county health boards, because there's a whole series of and layers of guidance you need to be aware of. And then when you're implementing your plan, you need to make sure that you incorporate those guidelines into your plan. But it's not just looking at one source. There's multiple sources you have to look through. And again, those are the CDC, OSHA, the state of Idaho, and different local counties and county health departments. So I'll just talk briefly about the CDC's guidance. That's the link to that website regarding their overall guidance is there on the slide. A couple of the important points that the CDC suggests is that you have someone who's kind of the coordinator, the point person for compliance with safety issues in your COVID-19 plan. The CDC also obviously gives you guidelines about frequent cleaning and disinfecting of the workplace. There's been over 300 cleaners that have identified that can effectively clean hard surfaces that have been exposed to COVID-19. Train your employees about how to use those. It's not just enough to say, okay, here are the cleaners. Make sure that the employees know how to use them and how to safely store them. That is part of the training that you need to implement. And the CDC also suggests that you increase social distancing between employees and customers. Kind of the standard that we've seen from the beginning is 6 feet. Although we'll talk about some specific recommendations with regard to restaurants in Idaho in a minute. OSHA's guidelines is another source you need to look at. These can be, there's general guidelines and there's also specific industry guidelines. And the link to that, the link to the OSHA webpage is there on the slide. There are some general guidelines that OSHA has for all businesses, such as use of personal protective equipment and chemicals for cleaning. OSHA guidelines also talk about, and Amy discussed this, and I think she's going to talk even more about it later on, is developing policies and procedures for prompt identification and isolation of sick individuals. It's really important that your plan, your reopening plan, address that, is how you're going to respond and how you're going to react when you have an employee who identifies positive. And again, OSHA kind of recommends, similar to what Amy talked about in the plan, is developing, implementing, and communicating workplace flexibilities and protections. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk really quickly about some of the, as Amy talked about, we're in stage 1 now, and the state of Idaho has guidelines for all businesses that can open in stage 1, and then it has some specific industry guidelines for particular industries. I don't think those would be particularly relevant to this group today, but things like daycares and other businesses that I don't think are within your business population, but I do believe that we've got a lot of folks who run restaurants. And so there are specific guidelines relating to stage 2 for restaurants to open. We're not in stage 2 yet, we're in stage 1. But when we get to stage 2 in Idaho, these are some of the guidelines the state of Idaho has recommended that restaurants follow. The first thing, as Amy mentioned, they must have a plan to mitigate the risks. Templates for those plans are available from the local public health districts. The plans must be submitted to the local health districts. They don't have to be approved. They have to be submitted. You should have your reopening plan available during any time that you might have an inspection or whether that's pre-opening or enforcement and food illness investigation. So make sure that you don't just create a plan and then bury it away in some file. It needs to be open. It needs to be available for you to provide to state and county inspectors if they come and inspect your business in the restaurants. The restaurants will be expected to adhere to these plans, and also restaurants, again, as we talked about, need to be looking for the guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration. So state of Idaho guidelines suggests to restaurants, make sure you look at the CDC guidelines and the FDA guidelines for opening a restaurant. Then there are some specific things that I thought were interesting that you ought to be aware of regarding opening your restaurant. Some of the requirements or suggestions already limit occupancy to 50% of the seating capacity in order to maintain 6 feet of physical distancing. You should limit tables to groups of 6 and space tables 10 feet apart. You should be eliminating, to the extent possible, waiting areas in the lobbies, and use traffic control measures, kind of what Amy talked about originally, is go through and, as you're looking through how your customers are going to be entering your space from the from the parking lot into the space, and they're going to be sitting at tables, and they're going to the restrooms. Think about ways that you can minimize people interacting with each other while they're moving from space to space. And think about the areas that are kind of the hotspot areas where there's going to be frequent touching of surfaces, and make sure that you have cleaning guidelines, that you clean those spaces and those parts of the restaurant regularly. Some other guidelines from the state of Idaho is limit employee and patron contact by using a reservation or call system and contactless payment methods. And we've probably all seen in restaurants when we're going to take out that they're now using those barriers. I'm sure a lot of shopping centers, at least in Utah, are using barriers to separate customers from the employees. And those are suggestions that we need to think about when we're reopening our restaurants, is contactless payment methods and using barriers to separate patrons of the restaurant and our employees. One of the things that also the state of Idaho is suggesting is requiring all employees in contact with patrons to wear cloth face coverings and gloves during their shifts. So that's something you need to think about. And let's talk about what those face coverings might look like. This is kind of in what we call personal protective equipment. And this is just an example of what PPE might look like. This is a PPE is a loose-fitting mask that is not intended to filter air. This is things like a surgical mask, a bandana, homemade mask that you're seeing a lot of employers adopt for their employees. There are specific guidelines and OSHA guidelines regarding use of these masks, but generally those guidelines say have your employees use the mask when there's a safety concern. And clearly, based on the state of Idaho guidance and also federal guidance, we do have a safety concern in our workplaces. So the state of Idaho is recommending that we use and we have our employees use and wear these types of masks. Another type of mask is a respirator, and this is not necessarily going to be applicable to people who have restaurants or people in the service industry, but I'm just want to just make you aware of, you hear the term respirator, and I just want to make sure you understand what that is. That's something like an N95 mask that actually filters the air. The state of Idaho is not requiring that you use these types of masks for your employees when you reopen. But if you are in the industry, and I don't know how many folks are in this industry, if you're in healthcare, that is what you need to be using, is a respirator. These types of N95 and above masks, which actually filter the air and actually protect the wearer, not just those around the wearer. Next slide. So again, healthcare workers need to wear respirators. People who are not in industry, the Idaho rebounds are path to prosperity. States that employers may require, and the state encourages you to require employees, vendors, and patrons to wear face coverings as a business practice. And again, this is, I think, some of the best practices, and it goes back to what I said in the beginning. If you really want to insulate yourself from potential liability, you want to manage the risk from employees and customers, and also create an environment where employees and customers can feel comfortable to the extent possible working and or buying your services and the products. I think it's a good idea to have the folks wear a mask. It's based on the guidance from the state of Idaho. Even though it's not required by the state of Idaho, it's strongly encouraged. And I think if you do that, you're going to go a long way to protecting yourself from potential liability, and also making your customers and your employees feel safe. One thing you need to think about when you're talking about or having your employees use masks is that some employees might have either disability or religious accommodation needs, so you might have to work with them about what type of mask they're wearing and the times that they're wearing those masks. That's just an issue to consider. And finally, probably one of the more important things that you don't necessarily think about is train your employees about how to use the mask appropriately. There is guidance from OSHA about how to train your employees in wearing face coverings. Look at that, be aware of it, and use it to train your employees. All right, we're next going to have Christina Jepson's going to talk about screening for COVID-19 when you're bringing your employees back to the workplace.
Great, thank you. As we talk about going back to work or continuing to work in this environment where COVID-19 is still spreading and we don't have a vaccine, we really have to think about what tools do we have to identify who might have the virus and should be kept out of the workplace. And we don't have a lot of tools. We can't, there aren't tests available to test everyone when they come into work every day. So we have to use the tools that we have. And here's a few of them. First of all is taking temperatures to screen for fever. That is one tool. Asking about symptoms, and you can do that in a variety of ways. You can ask people verbally, you can have them use apps, you can have them fill out a survey before they come to work, and same thing with asking about potential exposure. So those are three ways to try to find out, if we're letting people in the workplace who potentially have the virus. Now, I've been practicing employment law for 24, almost 25 years, and normally you wouldn't tell anyone to say, take employee temperatures or ask them, about symptoms that they have. That would really be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we're in a very different environment, obviously, and the tension between the ADA and the attempts to deal with this virus are clashing a little bit, but we're all trying to kind of figure out how to work that out. But all the guidance, whether it's the CDC, the federal government, the state of Idaho, everyone is saying, don't let employees with symptoms come to the workplace. We need to do what we can to figure out who those people are. If you are going to take temperatures, you should keep a log, and you might just keep a log of those who are above the threshold. You should also keep a log of anyone who has positive symptoms or exposure. But the really critical thing is that this log has to be kept very confidential. This is, basically medical information about people. So all the ADA guidelines that normally apply to medical information apply here. It has to be kept confidential in a separate file from the rest of their personnel file, and only shared with management on a need-to-know basis. It shouldn't be shared widely in your workplace. You also need to make sure that your screening is non-discriminatory. So if you're asking about symptoms, you're taking temperatures, you're asking about exposure, that should be done for everyone, not just people of a certain age or certain people who you think might be more at risk. It really has to be everyone, or you run the risk of having a discrimination lawsuit brought against you. Now, if you're going to take temperatures, one of the first things you have to do is you have to create a policy about what your temperature protocol is, and you need to set a criteria. What is the temperature over which someone will not be allowed in the workplace? And you have to apply that consistently. At the very least, it should be 100.4. That's what the CDC says constitutes a fever. You could even go a little bit lower. Some employers are going as low as 100. Next slide. When you're asking people about symptoms, and like I said, you can do this in a variety of ways. You can do this by an app, by a survey. You could have people call in the morning before they come to work. You could ask when they arrive to work, although there's some risk with that. If they already have symptoms, they shouldn't be coming in if they have symptoms at all. But you always have to stay informed about what the symptoms are, because as you probably know, when this first kind of came into our country, there were some limited symptoms we were looking for: cough, shortness of breath, fever, and now you can see that there's a lot more that are potential symptoms. So the CDC says if you have a cough or shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, just one of those is sufficient to keep someone out of the workplace. or at least 2 of the other symptoms, fever, chills, shaking, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, those sort of things. So that's what you're going to be asking people about in whatever method you decide is best. It's also good to ask people about exposure. So that is, have they had close contact with someone who's tested positive? Have they tested positive, obviously? If they've traveled to a high-risk area, they should quarantine for 14 days. And anyone with exposure should not come back to work until they are cleared. If you're going to take temperatures, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can either have people do it at home before they come to work and only come to work if they're under the threshold that you've set, or you can do it yourself at work. There's, obviously benefits and pros and cons to each. You have to have a lot of trust if people are doing it at home, but it's safer for your workplace. If you do it at work, you have to have protocol for doing it. If you're going to do it at work, you need to make sure that if you're doing it at home, you need to make sure you're training people about how to take their temperature, what sort of thermometers to use, what constitutes a fever. You need to make sure employees have access to thermometers. Those aren't easy to come by right now. If they don't, you're going to have to figure out how to get them to them if you're going to have a policy about this. If you're going to have them use apps, computer programs, et cetera, to ask about screening for symptoms of COVID, then you need to make sure everyone has that equipment. And then, some sort of procedure for reporting if they're above the temperature or if they have any symptoms. Some employers have had people take photos of their temperature and send it in, use Zoom to sort of, be present when they're taking their temperature so they know, they're doing it right. Or, if you really trust your employees to do that accurately, you can just have them report it. You have to decide if you're going to do it at work, who's going to take the temperatures. If you're lucky enough to have someone in the workplace who's trained, has some sort of medical background, that's the ideal person. If you do not, there are people you can hire to come in. Larger employers are doing that. Otherwise, you're just going to have to, pick the best person you can and get them trained on taking temperatures. And whoever's taking the temperatures needs to wear PPE to protect themselves because they're potentially coming in contact with someone who is exposed, and the people having their temperature taken should also be wearing a mask. If you're going to get thermometers for temperature taking, obviously you need to start right away. These are hard to come by. It's better to get the contactless kind, the infrared, where you can be somewhat distant from a person, but get on that right away if that's something you're planning on doing. Some other issues to keep in mind with temperature taking is you can't have people coming into work and getting in line to take temperatures in a big crowd and, congregated together. You still have to have social distancing. You still have to be cleaning equipment, cleaning high-touch areas involved in the temperature taking. All the guidelines we've been talking about apply to temperature taking as well. Some of the options for temperature taking at work include doing it outside of the workplace, in some sort of parking lot, perhaps. That's what the CDC really recommends because then you don't have people coming into the workplace. If they come into the workplace, then they have a high fever, you have to think about have they exposed others. You could have a drive-through screening process, you could have a trailer, you could have them come inside the facility, but keep them close to the front door so they're not potentially exposing a lot of people. If someone fails to pass the temperature screening or the symptom screening, they should not be allowed to come to work. They should be sent home if they are at work, and then you have to have procedures about when they're allowed to return to work. You need to follow up with the employee, see if they have been tested, what their test result was, if they've obtained any medical advice. Sometimes a person had a fever for a completely different reason. If they get medical clearance, and that's one thing. And also, if you think there is potential COVID, you need to notify all the people at work who came in contact with that person. So, keeping that name confidential, but letting people know that they were potentially exposed. Now, there's some pretty complicated criteria from the CDC about when you can return to work if you either have symptoms or you've been exposed or you've traveled to a high-risk area or if you have a temperature. So look at, look this over. This is, what you probably want to include in your policy is the things that would allow you to be cleared and come back to work after you've had one of those positives. once you've decided on a plan, you want it written in policy. We can help with that. We're doing a lot of plans along this lines. You should choose someone in your, like Amy and Sean talked about, some sort of facilitator who will be in charge of this plan, communicate it, train people, and do a dry run so you find out what the potential snags are with your policy. Other issues to consider is you do have to compensate people for screening time, and if someone truly refuses to be tested or provide answers to screening questions, you've got to decide how you're going to handle that. Trying to be understanding of people's concerns, but in the end, we do have to have these procedures followed. Now, the next thing I want to talk about briefly is protecting vulnerable persons. I think this is one of the most important things. As this virus has spread around the globe, one of the things the health communities have learned is that some people are a lot more at risk and a lot more at risk of developing very serious complications, obviously. Older people, people with certain underlying conditions, which are always kind of changing what they're figuring out the risky conditions are. And so one of the best things we can do to make this back to work succeed is protect those people and let people who are less likely to develop serious symptoms be more on the front lines of work. So when we look at the guidelines, and even what Idaho has said is that you should try to protect people who are in those vulnerable groups. We should make special accommodations for them. If they can stay at home, that's great. If they can telework, if they cannot, then you have to think about what can you do in the workplace for those people. Next slide. Now, you can't just treat people in those categories differently. You can't just say, well, anyone who's 65 or older, we're just not going to bring back to work, or anyone who's pregnant doesn't get to come to work, or if you have a condition, you can't come back to work, because that would be discrimination potentially. So what do you do? How do you protect those people and yet not tell them to come to work? What do you do? And the ADA also limits, asking them. You can't just ask people about their symptoms. So one thing we're suggesting that employers do, is just change your policies to encourage people to self-identify that they're in a vulnerable population and to come to you and talk about accommodations. And then you should treat that just like you would an ADA situation, where you really talk to them about what sort of accommodations you can set up to help them. Because employees can self-disclose disabilities, underlying conditions, and if they do, you just want to find out what you can do to make sure that they're protected in the workplace the best you can. So that means, like, maybe in a restaurant, someone who is vulnerable would be put in a different position instead of interacting with customers or having lots of interactions. Maybe there's something else that they can do where they'll be more protected. Now, ultimately, if an employee refuses to work, they don't want to come to work because they think it's unsafe, you should talk to them about it, see if there's some sort of accommodation concern. Treat that pretty carefully. I would talk to counsel before firing them. But ultimately, employees do have to come to work if they don't have an ADA reason for not coming to work. And, you'll ultimately probably have to make a hard decision about that. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to now turn time over to Liz Melmu, who's going to talk about request for leave and overview of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and policies.
Thank you, Sean. So as you all are hearing, there are a lot of considerations with reactivating or reopening your businesses. One of the things that you need to be aware of in terms of leave that may be requested by your employees is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I'm going to generally call that the Response Act while I speak. Some basic overview points. This requires employers to provide paid sick leave and paid family medical leave in certain circumstances related to this COVID-19 pandemic. This is a federal law, and it is a sea change for employers. There has never been a paid sick leave requirement under federal law until now. This law is effective from April 1st of this year through December 31st of the end of the year. So even though we may get to a point where COVID-19 starts to ramp down by September or so, the law currently is still going to be in place until the end of the year unless for some reason it's changed by that time. The law applies to all employers with less than 500 employees. That means that most employees are eligible for both or either kinds of leave. There are very limited exemptions for small businesses, and I will go over one of those exemptions later. Another exemption is the healthcare, employers for healthcare provider exemption. I'm not going to cover that given the audience that we have today, but know that that is out there in case for some reason it may apply to your business. Also know that really under this law, most employers are going to have to pay some sort of paid leave to their employees in certain circumstances. This applies even if you only have 1, 2, or 15 employees. You also must post federal notice of the employee's rights. You can provide that, you can find that notice on the Department of Labor's website, and I've provided the general link there. So the first bucket, there are 2 buckets of leave rights here. The first bucket allows for up to 2 weeks of pay because the employee themselves or someone close to them is affected by COVID-19. This is what we're calling the paid sick leave bucket. First of all, it could be the employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. They've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine because of COVID-19. They're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and are seeking a medical diagnosis, or they're caring for someone who they have a close relationship with, like a family member, and that family member is subject to local quarantine order or self-quarantine as described above. To quickly flip back real quick, under bucket number 1, that third bullet point down about the employee experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis. This is going to be the most common area where you're going to have an employee call in and say, oh, I've got a dry cough, I think I have a little bit of a fever, I need paid sick leave. Before you are required to pay that out, the employee has to also be seeking a medical diagnosis and understand that what you're required to give is not automatically 2 weeks of paid leave. It's going to be determined by the facts of the situation, by what the employee is claiming, and is likely going to be limited only to the time that they are spending seeking a medical diagnosis, and then will change once the employee receives or potentially receives a self-quarantine order from the healthcare provider. So the second bucket of leave, this is related to family medical leave. And if you are an employer that has less than 50 employees, you likely have never had to administer this program or have never experienced this program. But what this does is it allows up to 12 weeks of leave because the employee is caring for his or her child whose school or place of care is closed due to COVID-19 related reasons. This means daycare, it could potentially mean summer care programs and after school programs. This situation is the only situation in which the small business exemption might apply. And that is the requirements there are that the business has to have less than 50 employees and that they can show the leave would result in significant economic harm. And there are 3 different ways that they can do that. That's an or test, not an and test. So not all 3 have to be met, but they essentially revolve around whether or not allowing that employee to take the paid leave in this limited situation where they're caring for a child would jeopardize the financial viability of the business, basically prevent them from operating at a minimal capacity. That includes if you have an employee with very specialized knowledge or skill that you can't afford to let be absent, or if you don't have sufficient workers to fill in for a certain employee that's requesting this leave, or just paying out the leave is going to wipe out the resources, the financial resources of the company. So there is a test that's applied there. You want to document thoroughly what your determinations are and that you're taking that test, or taking the exemption, and then you keep that documentation for 4 years. You don't need to submit it anywhere to the Department of Labor or to the IRS or anything. but you do need to have it on hand in case there's some sort of audit in the future. Next slide, please. So under the leave rights, the entitlement, under bucket number 1, the employee is entitled generally to their full pay. That's capped at a little over $500 a day and $5,000, a little more than $5,000 in total, because it's spanning basically a 10-day work period, 2 work weeks. Bucket number 2 is only 2/3 of their pay. So if they are out because they are caring for a child whose school is closed, they don't get their full rate of pay. In terms of eligibility, bucket number 1, once an employee is employed by you, they are immediately eligible. So you could hire them, and 2 days later, they are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis, and they are eligible for that paid sick leave. Bucket number 2, if you are used to administering the FMLA program, it's very different eligibility. You don't have all of the requirements that they have to have worked a certain number of hours and you have a certain number of employees in your location. Instead, it's just once they've worked 30 days, they are eligible for that paid leave. However, the initial 2 weeks of the leave is unpaid unless they take leave under bucket number 1 for those first 2 weeks. Understand as well, too, that if you are already administering FMLA in your company, bucket number 2, the amount of leave available to the employee, that's reduced by the amount of any FMLA leave the employee has already taken in your rolling 12-month period that you've defined. So if you have an employee that perhaps had knee surgery 3 months ago and they took 10 weeks of their FMLA leave during that time, they will only have 2 weeks available under this bucket number 2 to them. So it creates a little bit of an administrative headache for whoever is doing your HR policies, but it's something you'll need to track and consider when you're administering and implementing this leave. The most important part of this is that you create and distribute a policy that's clear for your employees, that lets them know what they need to request and what they need to certify to you. For example, with the leave under the Family Medical Leave Act about caring for a child, your employee needs to be certifying that there is no other caregiver available to care for that child at the time. This isn't a situation the federal government has allowed 2 parents to take leave at the same time, paid to take care of their children. It needs to be one at a time. So we can certainly help with those policies. We've created them for a variety of different businesses, and we can help administer them, implement them with your other policies to weave them in and make them work together. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Liz. We're just going to talk about, Amy's going to talk about contact tracing and positive cases.
Hey, Amy, before you begin, it sounds like Pam just received guidance.
So Jason, you're a little bit quiet.
Hey, Pam, do you want to address the governor's guidance on protocol with respect to 10-foot tables?
Sure, I'll do that real quick. I just wanted to expand on one of the protocols that came out from the state on restaurant dining rooms, saying that tables need to be 10 feet away. So what they were thinking when they wrote that was that if you keep the table 10 feet away from each other, and then by the time you put chairs in and people are sitting in those chairs, then that will ensure that people are 6 feet away. However, they wrote that protocol when they were thinking that that's what the CDC was going to say. The CDC didn't address how far tables are at all. They just addressed the 6-foot part. So they have since come back, and I've had the discussion with the governor's office very recently, so this is very new. They've since come back and said that they're going to relook at that and that they're going to actually take that out and just make it very clear to everyone that when you're sitting in a restaurant dining room, everyone needs to be 6 feet apart, but that the public health districts are not going to be coming in and looking and measuring to make sure that tables truly are 10 feet away, and that they, again, they might just reissue those protocols and take that section out. We've been receiving so many calls on that that I just wanted to clarify that before more started coming in. So thank you.
Thank you, Pam.
Thanks, Pam. So I have included some slides on testing, which I will not talk about, just in case you get questions or you have questions on if you should test your employees for COVID-19 before they come back to work. Just know that the onus is on the employer to make sure that tests are accurate and reliable. So pay attention to what is also going on with questions about antibody tests and COVID-19 tests, and make sure you get your guidance for that. Then I have slides on when an employee tests positive. Essentially, and you can go through those, you need to remember that if someone is exposed, you should treat them as a positive. You should give a human response first. You should follow the CDC guidance and assure the employee that you won't let others know what their identity is. So you will need to inform those who were in close contact with that employee without giving the identity or even confirming it if asked. And then once you have a confirmed positive, you need to look at getting your employees all quickly tested, or those who were within 6 feet of another person for 10 minutes or more, or if they've kind of been in the same area and touched the same thing. Decide whether, or follow guidance on whether you need to close for a period of time for cleaning, and consider what to do when employees say that they may not be able to go home. Some of your hotel members may have some people staying with them now who are, presumed positive, probably fine, but aren't able to go home. You may need to provide an option for them. And then basically, this is where you see if you've implemented all the correct policies. So it's an opportunity to either, see that the breakout or infection was localized or not, and then you may need to change some of your cleaning policies. Make sure you work with your local health district. They are the ones also doing the contact tracing. You'll certainly probably get a call from them, and they will probably be doing it before you are, but and you certainly want to work with them, and you are allowed to tell a health district. The EEOC has now said, as of I think April 9th, that you're allowed to say, yes, this employee did test positive. And that is all I have. Sean, do we have?
Great, thank you very much, Amy. We do have one question that's come in. Pam, are you okay if we address this question?
Oh.
Okay, Sean, why don't I leave this to you, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jason.
Great. What if a former employee offers to volunteer to help during closure, doing tasks that would not be part of normal job duty, i.e. server wants to help with marketing or menu? Is this permitted? Excuse me. Is this permitted, or would we have to pay a wage for something we would not otherwise do?
That's, obviously the concern there is that there's rules under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's rules under the Idaho state laws that you have to pay employees for the work they do. Now, whether or not if an employee wants to volunteer his or her time, it makes me uncomfortable, but I think as long as you are clearly documenting that this is not an expectation, is not part of their regular job duties, and that they're doing it purely on a volunteer basis. I guess you could, it still makes me nervous, and it makes me concerned about doing that, because you ultimately might come back and have a wage claim, and the employee, even if they sign a document saying I'm doing this voluntarily, you can't really waive your rights to be paid wages, and so you're always going to have the risk of a wage claim. So I guess my thoughts to that would be, understand that if you do that, you're going to have the risk. If you do it, make sure you have them sign a document that they're doing it voluntarily, but you're still going to have a risk, and whether the amount of that risk is going to depend on the individual temperament of that employee, which is something that you're going to know better than anyone else. Whether that employee is likely to turn around at some point and say, well, no, even though I said it was voluntary, I need to get paid for it. But there is a risk. There's always going to be a risk, and if they sign a document, that they're going to turn around and make a wage claim, and they can't waive their rights to be entitled to pay wages, and so it's a risky proposition. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that are different or want to expand on that. Anyone? What does everyone else think?
No, I think you covered it, Sean. It's a tricky situation for sure.
Great. Well, thank you, Sean. And as we mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, a recording will be provided to all of the attendees and to all of you by way of email. We will also include our slide deck. I want to take a quick moment to extend a huge thanks to all of our presenters. I want to thank Pam Eaton for partnering with us today and providing us with this opportunity. And most importantly, we'd like to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. We recognize that all of you are dealing with very challenging times right now, and we hope that today's information provides you with the guidance, the tools, and the resources to successfully move forward. We wish you all the best. We wish your businesses prosperity and health to all of you, your colleagues, and your family. Thank you very much.